On the very same day the House is sending those articles of impeachment, we are digging into fascinating, newly released evidence that, honest to goodness, sounds like it was lifted from the pages of a spy novel. At the heart of it, the president's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, seeking a personal meeting with the president of Ukraine just weeks after he was elected. And encrypted messages between Giuliani's associate, Lev Parnas, and former landscaping company owner, Trump donor, turned aspiring Republican politician who may have been tracking the movements of the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. NBC national political reporter Josh Lederman has been looking into all of this. Josh, bottom line, what is this?
Well, those text messages you were just showing possible surveillance of Yovanovitch are harrowing, Stephanie. But there's another key fact that came out in these documents last night, which is a newly released letter in which Rudy Giuliani tells President Zelensky that he's acting with President Trump's knowledge and consent in requesting a meeting with Zelensky just after Zelensky was elected. We also have evidence, Stephanie, of what looks like another proposed quid pro quo. This one not with the president, but with former prosecutor Lutsenko, who in these text messages with Parnas is saying he won't turn over dirt basically on the Bidens unless the Trump administration gets rid of his enemy, Ambassador Yovanovitch. And as we know, the White House, the president ultimately did fire Ambassador Yovanovitch. All of this, Stephanie, likely to increase pressure on Republican senators and Mitch McConnell to allow witnesses in these Senate trial so that there can be evidence heard about these new facts, new parts of the timeline that never came up during the House impeachment hearings.
Okay, we're not talking about any official agency. We're not even talking about a lawmaker. Who in the world is Robert Hyde? He's a new name for all of us.
He is. He's a character we had no idea was even part of the impeachment saga until these documents came out last night. So he is a Republican congressional candidate in Connecticut who appears to have ingratiated himself with Trump and his orbit by making a lot of donations to the president and to Republicans. He showed up at Mar-a-Lago. There's lots of photos with him, like this one of him with President Donald Trump. And he's a very bombastic guy. He had to delete a very offensive tweet about Kamala Harris after she dropped out of the presidential race. And in a text message to me last night, as we were asking him about this, Stephanie, he brushed all of this off, didn't back down, but said that these were just some texts that he'd sent to some, quote, dweeb while he was having some drinks with his friends.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.